The pressure's on, and it's not letting up. As development and testing teams will no doubt attest to, time and resources are often items in short supply. In fact, you could say the phrase, do more with less, has never rung so true. The unsung heroes in these projects are the teams of professionals that deliver rock-solid work despite the many challenges that confront them on a daily basis. By viewing this report, professionals will gain valuable insights that will help them to improve software quality and increase productivity across the life cycles of their most critical projects. This program features interview guest Rex Black, president of RBCS. For almost 20 years, RBCS has delivered consulting, outsourcing, and training services in the areas of software, hardware, and systems testing and quality. There are several teaching points in the program. First, we'll discuss the testing landscape today. Then we'll offer advice and best practices that will help teams to deliver stellar projects on time and on budget. Next, a discussion about how to keep the team motivated and engaged across the project lifecycle. We'll wrap up with a brief summary and concluding thoughts from our expert, Rex Black. Now, let's begin our program. In our first segment, we'll present an overview of the testing landscape today. So, why do we test? Let's briefly review the reasons. Software testing is mandated to ensure that the new product being tested is correct and complete. The goal of the testing process is that in the end, a high-quality product will be delivered to the customer. Experts tell us that testing has become one of the most critical parts of the software development process. Now, we're all painfully aware that there have been many occasions where software did not function as it was designed to. The impact of a failure can lead to all sorts of issues, from a damaged business reputation to lost time and money, and in an extreme case, even death and destruction. With the stakes that high, organizations need to ensure that testing is always considered a top priority item in the software development lifecycle. To help us assess the current landscape and critical nature of testing today, let's welcome our guest expert, Rex Black, to the program. Rex, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mike.
Now, Rex, we know that software testing is a key part of the software development lifecycle. We also realize that any testing must be both effective and efficient. With that said, just give us a snapshot of the software testing landscape today.
So a number of interesting things are going on that in software engineering in general that affect testing. So you have a move towards these agile methodologies by a lot of organizations that has proven to be, I'd say, fairly disruptive in terms of the disruptive in both good and bad ways. The sort of the economics meaning of that term, that it's brought a lot of new tools and a new focus on quality into software development that has been helpful. But it's also kind of dislodged some of the traditional ideas of how to go about doing software testing, and some people are kind of thinking, well, maybe it's, these ideas are not as applicable. So part of the challenge is figuring out how to incorporate known best practices into the Agile methodology. So that's I think, one dynamic that's playing out right now. We are seeing very positive developments in terms of general improvement of the skills of people involved in testing. That continues to evolve fairly rapidly and has gained momentum over the last, say, 10 or 15 years. So that's, I think, a very positive trend that more people involved in testing do take the skills seriously and actually know how to be effective testers. Tools remain a mixed bag. Tool support, as I said, out of the Agile methodologies, there are some tools that are becoming, and they are useful to testers, though the primary focus of a lot of the tools is really at the development level. So the tooling at the independent tester level remains kind of hit and miss. There are a lot of commercial tools out there, but I hear a lot of complaints from clients that the price is very high and the return on investment actually relatively low, and in some cases negative when the tools aren't used properly. So that remains a fairly significant challenge. So, so it's an interesting landscape. A lot of things going on. Some of them external to testing, some internal to testing that causes the profession to continue to evolve.
Rex, what do you believe to be the fundamental challenges to competent software testing today?
I would say that one of the biggest challenges actually is not so much an issue of competence, but it's an issue of a disconnect between software testers on the one hand and the stakeholders they serve on the other. What I find working with clients is when I talk to these stakeholders about testing, they generally have a poor idea at best of what testing is about and how it benefits them. They have a lot of misunderstandings of what testing can actually accomplish. There seems to be a prevalent belief that testers should be able to find all the bugs rather than find a significant percentage of the important bugs, which is what testing can actually do. So, yeah, it's interesting. When I first started doing consulting work many years ago, I expected that what I would find is that most of the problems that face test groups actually grew out of the competence of the testers themselves, or a lack of resources or something like that. And those issues are there, but generally the most serious problems confronting testers have to do with this disconnect between testing and the services they provide, and a misunderstanding of those services by the stakeholders who need them.
Next, we'll offer best advice and best practices that will enable teams to deliver stellar projects on time and on budget. You don't have to look very hard to find a story about a software development project gone wrong. One story of particular note is the case of investment firm Knight Capital. The Wall Street firm lost a reported $440 million in less than 30 minutes' time due to what was called a trading glitch. After a complete investigation, the reality of the situation was that poor development and testing of a new application was the actual root of the cause. So, as not to end up in the same boat as Knight Capital, what can be done to avoid these disastrous outcomes? An article in CIO Online, authored by Matthew Husser, a Michigan-based technology consultant and writer, offered the following techniques for reducing development risk factors. First, Husser recommends improving change and configuration management. Second, he suggests we improve production monitoring. Third, that we view testing as a high-level risk management process. And finally, he calls for increased internal controls on high-volume transactions. Husser also encourages organizations to examine systems and how they interoperate while determining the value of investing time and energy in risk management. At the very least, putting these ideas into practice might very well keep your team out of the headlines. Now, let's return to our interview guest, Rex Black, and hear some advice and best practices that will help deliver successful development and testing projects. Now, Rex, we're trying to get our software testing and development viewers to think outside the box. Sure, we're testing basic functionality, but we want to have them go above and beyond that. Now, you yourself have encouraged testing teams to learn by the study of mistakes as a path toward improved software development and testing. Could you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's very important, that all too often the focus is on testers say, give me a set of functional requirement specifications. I'll take those, I'll transform those into test cases, and I'll run those, and then I'm done. That leaves out of the testing picture some very important non-functional attributes of software, such as performance, reliability, usability, portability across different platforms, and so forth. So certainly, testers need to think beyond just what's the functionality and the requirements. They have to think about these non-functional attributes, which in some cases can be just as important as the functional attributes, if not more so. They also have to realize that any set of tests that are created purely from an analysis of a requirement specification, design specification, and so forth, is inadequate in terms of the coverage that it provides. You have to think of the test basis, what you base your tests on, as going beyond specifications, including things like supported configurations, the different kinds of users that you're going to support and their personas, the important risks that you're dealing with, and so forth. It's often possible through some creative thinking, and I've done this with clients, to identify 6 or 7 different dimensions of coverage in addition to the requirement specifications. So that's an example, Mike, of what you're talking about, kind of thinking outside the box, if we think of the box as the requirement specification itself. It's also, I think, important even with a written set of tests, that the tester realize that they're likely to discover things that are interesting while they're running the test that aren't part of the test. So testers should not feel constrained by the test. I tell testers and test managers that test scripts or test cases, written tests, should be seen as a roadmap that gets you to interesting places. If you get someplace interesting, stop and look around. Don't just drive through.
You've also stated in your presentations that testing is really a service. In that case, what should be kept top of mind in order to deliver good service?
In order to deliver a good service, you really have to understand your stakeholders and what they want. It's a matter of identifying the objectives that your stakeholders have, and which are reasonable. So there's often a negotiation process there. For example, the stakeholders might consider one of the important objectives to be to find defects. In that case, then the important questions are, what percentage of the defects do we need to find? And how much more focus do you want us on the important defects versus overall defects? In other words, do you want more depth of coverage in important areas, or are you also looking for breadth, and how do we balance that? And then, of course, there's efficiency issues, right? What are we willing to spend in terms of finding these defects? What kind of level of investment are we making? And there's also overall stakeholder satisfaction that needs to be considered. So I encourage clients to clearly define the objectives for testing, clearly define metrics that can be used to measure the effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction with which those objectives are being achieved, and then work to continuously improve that. That requires a collaboration with the stakeholders, and of course that collaboration with the stakeholders sends a message that we in the testing organization care about delivering a valuable service, and that message by itself is almost as valuable as actually delivering the service.
Well, Rex, I'd bet that in many cases, testers tend to look no further than the project's requirement specifications, but that's not the right way to do it, is it? The full dimension of test coverage needs to come into play. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So, according to some industry studies, for example, by Capers-Jones, a sizable percentage, and in Jones's studies he puts this number at 45%, of defects are introduced in requirement specifications and design specifications. So if we use that as our yardstick of what constitutes quality, we're basically half wrong right from the start. Now, I'm not saying don't pay attention to the specifications. Obviously, if a piece of software does not behave as specified, there is a problem. But the problem could just as easily be in the specifications as in the software itself. So there needs to be a mindset on the tester's part that any source of information about how the software is supposed to behave is fallible and limited, which of course is true because these are all human work products that we're talking about, right? So with that in mind, the tester has to be ready to go beyond that. So do a risk analysis with the other stakeholders. The requirements say what we want the software to do. Risk analysis about what we're afraid the software might do. That inversion of perspective is very useful in terms of ferreting out other additional areas to test. Think about supported configurations. These days, everything is connected to everything else. There's a proliferation of smartphones and tablets and operating systems for those platforms, and of course, security software, antivirus software, and so on, different browsers, versions of browsers, plugins. There are a lot of things that need to be considered with respect to configurations. Users use software in different ways. There's the obvious thing like security, like who is allowed to do what, and of course that has to be tested, but there's also just the basic user persona. People interact with systems in different ways. For example, I'm not the world's most patient guy, which is why I don't live in Los Angeles anymore. I had to move to Texas to get a little less frenetic. I don't like to wait for the computer to do something. So if I click and something doesn't happen, I'm clicking again. That's a distinct style of interacting with a computer, and some people have that and some people don't. Other people are more patient and will just sit there and watch the little wheels spin around for a while. So people interact with software in different ways, and if the testers aren't aware of those different ways of interaction, they're going to miss some important areas of testing. Data is another dimension that can be very interesting. Very different kinds of data sets could be used by different kinds of users. To use one example, a relatively simple one, I've written a number of books and articles and so forth, and these are technical books and articles. So I use a word processor in a way that is very different than a lawyer would use a word processor. Lawyers create legal documents. They have to have certain formats. There's citation rules. Those documents look very different than an article written for a technical publication. So if testers don't think about the different kinds of data that are going to be used by their users, that's again another dimension that they'll miss. And requirement specifications rarely say anything about issues like risks and personas and styles of use, security, data, and so on. So really testers really have to think outside of that, the tight constraints of those documents.
Well, Rex, you always talk about the value of continuous skills growth as a path to developing a top-shelf test team. Give us your perspectives on evaluating teams and putting in a plan to strengthen staff skill sets.
Great. Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics, Mike. So this is really a fairly straightforward process, but unfortunately a lot of organizations don't do it. The first step is to look at what your organization needs to do. Not necessarily what it's doing now, but what it needs to do, because sometimes there's a misalignment there. Having identified what services you need to provide, then the next step is to figure out what tasks have to be carried out to support those services. After doing that, you then need to analyze for each of those tasks, what are the skills that people would need to have to be competent at those tasks. This allows you to come up with a skills inventory, form of a matrix, and then you can assess the current competence of your staff against those skills. This allows you to then do a gap analysis and figure out where you're weak and where you're strong. And then you have to do an impact analysis on that and look at, of those gaps, how do I rank those? And the size of the gap may not be the same as the impact. You may be very weak in a particular skill area, but that might be having a relatively small impact compared to another skill area where you're closer to where you need to be, but the impact of not being fully competent is very significant. Having done that impact analysis, then you're able to come up with a training program, both short-term and long-term, how you're going to increase the skills of the people within your team. I would generally say focus on increasing skills. Don't look at the assessment as a way of identifying who to fire, right? Unless there's somebody who actually needs to be fired for a really bad attitude, these skills assessments should be done from the point of view of how am I going to improve my team. Then you put the program into action, the training program into action, and continuously monitor the growth of the skills over time to make sure that it's moving you in the right direction. In addition, every year or so, you need to go back and reevaluate the tasks and thus the skills to make sure that your skills inventory is current, because things change. And you look at any organization over a period of a few years, new skills will be required throughout the organization in various groups that weren't required before.
And Rex, how can you keep the testing team happy, motivated, and engaged? I mean, that's a goal all project managers want to attain. Can you offer any advice?
Well, yes, Mike, this is a big challenge because testing operates downstream from other elements of the life cycle, and it is possible for undesirable, unfortunate events upstream to ripple through and have an impact on testing. The classic example in a sequential life cycle model is internal deadlines slip. The testing, which is at the end, gets squeezed, but management maintains pressure to continually test all of the things which were originally planned for a much longer period of time. So, yeah, it is challenging. And so one of the main things I think in ensuring good morale in your test organization is look for ways to avoid burnout. It's very easy for testers to get burnout, and things like pointless overtime that are just done in the sake of being able to say we tried everything possible, we threw every resource we could at it so the project wouldn't fail. That's the kind of thing that is, it just doesn't make any sense, and it's going to burn people out. So look for ways to sidestep pointless exercises that are going to demotivate your team. People are smart. They can tell when they're being invited to the charge of the light brigade. You know, they know when their disaster is going to happen, when it's a waste of their time. So they'll also be able to recognize when a good test manager or director of testing is trying to protect them from that. So I found that's really important. You know, stand up for your team, defend them. And, you know, in those cases where you do have to ask them to do something that's unpleasant or difficult, like work weekends, work long hours and such, of course the manager has to be there as well. You know, slinging your golf clubs over your shoulder at 5 o'clock on a Friday and heading out and saying, I hope you guys all have a nice weekend in here. You know, that's a sure way to have part of that weekend involve testers polishing up their resume to look for another job.
And finally, what's your advice on the critical area of documentation? How much is enough?
That's really important. One of the mistakes that testers make frequently is to over-document, to look at the creation of extensively documented test cases as their primary objective, or one of their primary objectives. In fact, if you talk to stakeholders, external stakeholders, people outside of testing, very few of them will ever say, we want to see well-documented test cases. Now, there are exceptions to that. For example, in FDA-regulated situations where being able to provide evidence of testing is important. And indeed, people outside of testing will say that tests have to be documented well enough to satisfy an FDA auditor. But in that case, it's not the manager's concern as to what the level of detail is. It's the FDA auditor's concern and satisfaction that is the target there, right? The stakeholder themselves doesn't really have a target for the documentation. They just want to make sure that it's sufficient to satisfy the auditor. Taking that kind of situation off the plate and saying, okay, documentation is being created for internal use, then it's like anything else. You need to identify who the audience is for the written communication, in this case the test case, and what the goals and objectives are for that. Is the goal to provide guidance to skilled and experienced testers who understand the product and how to use it, in which case the level of documentation can be fairly high. If the goal is to create documentation that can be given to any tester regardless of their level of skill, and they can be able to reproduce exactly the same test regardless of who we give it to, then there's more detail needed. Unfortunately, very few organizations actually sit back and examine this carefully and determine what the appropriate level of documentation is, which means that test cases get written at a both over-documented and under-documented level. There's too much information provided about certain things which are probably obvious to everybody, too little information provided about things which are not. So this is a significant source not only of inefficiency, but also of ineffectiveness, because it leads to people missing important coverage areas and important defects.
Rex, I know you and your firm are active promoters of risk-based testing. In a nutshell, please explain it and discuss the method and its benefits.
Yeah, risk-based testing actually, Mike, is a very intuitive kind of thing. We apply the basic concept of risk-based testing in our everyday life all the time. You wouldn't buy insurance for something that you weren't worried about. There was something that could happen to you that did not seem to you to be very likely or have a significant impact, you would probably say, no, I'm not going to buy insurance for that, right? But for those things which are more serious, either in terms of likelihood or impact or both, we do carry insurance, right? For likely events such as car accidents, which aren't generally very serious, but they happen, you know, with some frequency. Very few drivers go through, you know, a decade without having one. We purchase insurance for that. And for things that can have a higher impact, you know, such as life insurance, catastrophic medical insurance, and so forth, we want to make sure that we're covered for that. So risk-based testing is basically the same thing. Think about what could go wrong with your software, what's the likelihood and impact, and target the amount of money that you invest in testing on the things which are the most likely to happen and or have the highest impact. In addition, we want to address those things which have the highest likelihood and or impact as early as possible in the life cycle so that we can front load the risk removal process so that we're not worried about big nasty surprises, late discovery of project imperiling defects right at the end of the schedule.
Next, some concluding remarks from our guest, Rex Black. In this program, we presented an overview of the software testing landscape today. We offered advice and best practices to help enable teams to deliver projects on time and on budget. And then we discussed how to keep development and testing teams motivated and engaged across the project lifecycle. Next, we'll wrap up with the summary and concluding thoughts from our expert, Rex Black. Now, Rex, as we wrap up our programs, could you leave us with a closing thought for our viewers?
Don't ever accept a single document as the source of truth, right? There is no one document that's going to be this infallible thing that if I test and cover this, then I'm done. This is a common mistake. Fortunately, it is a mistake that is easy to go beyond because there are many other strategies for testing that allow you to go beyond a simple analytical requirements-based approach. So I would encourage people to examine those other strategies, to think without the constraints of any sort of dogma or externally imposed ideas about what testing is. I'm shocked when I see somebody on Twitter saying, well, testing is this or testing is that. Well, how do you know what testing is? That's what it is for you, right, in your current situation, but for somebody else it can be something different. So think in an open-ended and creative way about who your stakeholders are, what they need, how to satisfy them, and then let that drive the way you go about testing rather than some rigid, if it ain't in the requirement spec, I'm not testing it approach.
Well, Rex, thanks so much for sharing some great information with us today.
Great. Thanks very much, Mike. Enjoyed the conversation.
Well, that completes our report, Testing Methodologies and Improvements, Thinking Outside the Box. I'm Michael Quinlan, and thanks so much for watching.